Today's case is a tragic story about how not everyone is your friend. On February 8, 1988 at 11:30 p.m., Alton Cooley ran out of his apartment screaming, "Come here quick, they killed my boy." Alton had just found his 12-year-old son, Antonio, lifeless in his bedroom. He immediately knew who did it. Antonio's friends, David Burns and Joe McDonald. The how and the why the two teens killed their friend will leave you disgusted. The tragic case of Antonio Cooley. He was a kid so sweet that they nicknamed him after Winnie the Pooh. Antonio Pooh Cooley was born on January 13, 1976 in Dayton, Ohio. He was Alton Cooley's only son, and Antonio was his world. Really, he was the kind of kid everyone wanted. Small for his age, Antonio was a loving child who helped anyone that asked. He was a great student and won multiple awards at school. Even though he was the oldest out of his mother's children, all he ever wanted was a big brother. Antonio's parents, Alton and Betsy, weren't together, but amiably co-parented Antonio. So when Betsy decided to move to North Carolina in 1987, Antonio's grandmother asked if Antonio could stay with her and her son. Antonio was eager to live with his dad, and Betsy didn't see a problem with it. After moving in, Antonio, Alton, and Antonio's grandmother were like three peas in a pod. Alton worked hard as a school janitor to give his son the best of everything. In his new apartment complex, Antonio would run errands for his neighbors and was an all-around good kid. Sadly, in October 1987, Antonio's grandmother died, and their trio became a duo. Due to his father's working the second shift, Antonio was often left to his own devices until nearly midnight every day. The passing of his grandmother only added to his solitude, leaving him alone at home for hours. Antonio's father recognized the dangers of leaving his son by himself, so he told Antonio every day to keep the door locked and not to let anyone in when he was by himself. Maybe it was because Antonio always wanted a big brother, but he quickly made friends with 5 older teens from the neighborhood. His new friends were 15-year-olds Joe McDonald and David Burns, and 13-year-olds Melissa Harrison, Angela Covington, and Jamal King. What Antonio didn't know was that the 2 older boys were trouble. David Burns came from a rough background. He suffered a devastating loss at 7 when his older brother died in a car accident, and his mother was an alcoholic who had a stroke and was unable to take care of him. His living conditions were so bad that CPS nearly removed him from his home. With no stability in his life, David was always in trouble. He skipped school, got into fights, and was even arrested for damaging a video machine at a video rental store. Also, David was a known thief who was in and out of juvenile detention centers. While Joe McDonald's record was less extensive, he was also a known thief. He stole a boat 2 years prior and was arrested for throwing a chair at a girl. But Joe was more known around the neighborhood for having a gun and regularly selling stolen goods. In the beginning, everything seemed fine, but the relationship between Antonio, David, and Joe soured after an argument. On February 1st, 1988, Antonio refused to let Joe and David inside of his house. And as revenge, Joe threw a brick in Antonio's bedroom window. Antonio's father later reported the incident to the police, and that angered Joe so much that he swore revenge. After that, Antonio made sure to keep his distance from the troubled teens. On February 8, 1988, Antonio and the 13-year-olds were hanging out at Angela's house to look at a photo album. Their lazy Monday afternoon abruptly ended when there was a knock on the door. It was Joe, and he had a dirty movie called Life Force. One of the kids told Joe that Antonio was there, and Joe wanted Antonio to take him back to his apartment so that he could use Antonio's VCR. Antonio immediately shot the idea down because his dad told him that under no circumstances was anyone allowed in the apartment when he wasn't home. And on top of that, his dad had recently changed the locks, and Antonio didn't have a key. Jamal, his best friend, tried to convince Antonio to let them use his VCR to watch Life Force. Life Force is a movie about space vampires landing in London with plenty of nudity and sex scenes, and Jamal really wanted to watch it. That didn't sway Antonio again, but Joe was older and bigger, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. He accused Antonio of lying and bullied the 12-year-old until he relented. As the group walked, Antonio secretly told one of the girls that he didn't want Joe in his house. Just like Antonio said, the door was locked. But Joe wasn't going to let a locked door stop him. He went around the apartment until he found an unlocked window. He climbed in, then unlocked the door for everyone else. Antonio nervously let his friends use his electronics for about an hour until he became so anxious that he told them they had to go. But Joe wasn't going anywhere. He said he paid $3 to rent that movie and he was going to watch it, or kick Antonio's butt. When he couldn't get them to leave, Antonio ran to get the landlord and told him what was going on and that the boy that broke the window the week before was in his house. The landlord kicked everyone out, and that just made Joe angrier. That was going to be the last time Antonio ever told on Joel again. It didn't take long for the group to meet up with David Burns at his house. When he was told about what happened, he wanted in on Joe's revenge plot. Joe, David, and Jamal decided Antonio needed to learn a lesson. They were going to go back to Antonio's place and rob him for his expensive electronics. But Joe had a darker plan in mind. He told the group, "I'm going to kill him. He's going to date." 12-year-old Antonio Cooley's fate was sealed, all because he wouldn't let Joe watch a dirty movie on his VCR. The teens met up with David Burns at his house. The plan was simple. Antonio was more likely to let the girls back in, and once in, one girl would distract Antonio while the other girl unlocked the window so the boys could sneak in. Since Jamal, Melissa, and Angela didn't believe that Joe was really going to kill Antonio, they agreed with the plan. The teens quickly put their plan into action and returned to Antonio's apartment. Just like they predicted, Antonio let the girls back inside. One of the girls distracted Antonio as the others secretly let the three boys in. The horror that Antonio must have experienced when he saw Joe and David back in his home is unimaginable. As soon as Joe and David saw Antonio, they went on the attack. They beat him up and then dragged the crying and screaming 12-year-old into his father's room. Angela, Melissa, and Jamal remained in the living room, too afraid to leave. All three heard Antonio's desperate cries for Joe and David to leave him alone. After a while, Joe left the bedroom and went into the kitchen to get a can of roach spray and lighter fluid. When he went back in, Antonio's yelling turned into begging and he said, "Stop, leave me alone, I'll do anything, just don't hurt me." As Joe continued his brutal assault, David and Jamal went outside around 6 p.m. A neighbor named Floyd Thomas came to see what was going on after his wife told him that she saw some suspicious teens hanging around Antonio's door. When he went to investigate, he saw the boys and told them to leave. After that, he knocked on the door and asked if Antonio was alright, but there was no answer. Floyd Thomas was clueless to the torture that Antonio was being subjected to only a few feet away. Inside, Joe soaked a sock with roach spray and stuffed it into Antonio's mouth. But Joe still wasn't satisfied with that, and so he sprayed it in Antonio's face. Antonio screamed, "Please, please, I can't see. Don't spray my eyes again." But the last words anyone ever heard Antonio say was, "I'll do whatever you say. I'll drink it. Please don't kill me." He was given lighter fluid and he reluctantly drank it. As his body shut down from the poison, David put a bag over Antonio's head. Moments later, Joe walked out of the room and announced, "We've done it. I killed him and y'all didn't think I was going to do it, did you?" Joe walked back into the room and noticed that Antonio was still breathing. He told David, "He ain't dead. I told you we should have stabbed him." David then put a pillow over Antonio's face and suffocated him. Worried that Joe really did kill Antonio, Angela and Melissa walked into the room and were greeted by the sight of Antonio laying on his father's bed with a plastic bag and a pillow over his head. Angela walked up to him and whispered for him to play dead. What she didn't realize was that he was already gone. When Antonio stopped moving, Joe, David, and Jamal robbed his home of a VCR, stereo, and an Atari. With their ill-gotten gains in tow, Joe and David caught a ride with Joe's brother, 19-year-old Daryl. He wasn't surprised when he saw them with a stolen VCR. His brother sold stolen items all of the time. So when Daryl asked where they got it from, they excitedly told Daryl what they had done. Daryl was appalled. He didn't want anything to do with the VCR and kicked the teenagers out of his car. When he got home, he called an emergency line to tell the police what happened. By the time that Antonio's father, Alton, got off the bus, it was 11:30 at night. On the way home, his landlord stopped him to talk about the teenagers at the apartment, but Alton wanted to change his clothes first and talk to Antonio. When he stepped inside, he knew immediately something was wrong. He rushed to his room and found his son's lifeless body on his bed. Overcome with grief, he ran out of his apartment screaming, "Come here quick, they've killed my boy." As Antonio's family mourned and wondered who could commit such a senseless crime, Melissa and Angela couldn't keep what happened a secret. The next day, the girls confessed to their principal. All 5 teenagers were arrested the day after the murder. Joe, David, and Jamal were charged with delinquency by reason of aggravated murder and grand theft. Angela and Melissa were charged with delinquency by reason of involuntary manslaughter by felonious assault and grand theft. In April, Jamal pled guilty and was convicted after testifying against Melissa and Angela. He received 6 months in state custody. Melissa and Angela pled guilty and were convicted and received 1 year in state custody. Joe and David had a hearing in April to determine whether or not they would be tried as adults. After hearing the gruesome details, the judge declared that they would be. The following month, the pair both pled not guilty to the original charges plus the charge of child endangerment. The state decided to add that charge because of the torture that Antonio endured. Joe and David had separate trials in August and September 1988. When the news broke about what happened to Antonio, the crime became a rallying cry to those who said that teen violent crime was at an all-time high. Controversially, the prosecutor wanted to add the death penalty. However, in Ohio, it's illegal to put a minor to death. In each trial, the teenagers took turns pinning the blame on each other. Joel's trial was first. He testified that it was actually David that killed Antonio, and he was trying to save the 12-year-old. Joe claimed that he left the room to get a Twinkie and a soda, and when he returned, David had put a bag over Antonio's head. Joe said they weren't going to do that and took the bag off, but that contradicted the testimony of the 3 13-year-olds. His lawyer argued that the 3 teens were lying to save their own skins, but the judge didn't buy it. After 4 days, he was found guilty of all charges. David's trial happened a week later. Joe's brother Daryl testified during David's trial about what the two did to Antonio. The prosecution also used David's bloody sweatshirt as evidence. David didn't testify and the defense didn't call any witnesses. The defense argued that Joe was the ringleader and he was able to convince the other children to attack Antonio, but the judge didn't buy that excuse. After 2.5 days of testimony, David was found guilty of all charges. Joe and David were sentenced to life in prison. Before announcing their sentences, the judge said that he reviewed the psychological reports, trial evidence, and even the teens' faces for remorse, but he said he saw none. The judge said that the pair had a total lack of regard or even awareness of causing suffering of life. As of the making of this video, David and Joe are still serving their life sentences. Thank you for watching The Twin Files. After 35 years in prison, do you think David Burns and Joe McDonald should be released? Let us know in the comments.